Hi everybody, this is the video with an overview and information for what you'll need to do your work in Unit 3, and that's really planning for your data collection. So I've broken this video series up into 3 chunks, and this first one is getting started, and there'll be another one about data sources, and then another one about field notes. So as you're getting started, keep in mind that your action research plan that you submit really is a fluid plan. It is not written in stone. It definitely can have changes to it, although I wouldn't recommend totally changing your topic because that can mean a lot of extra work. You definitely can revise the wording of your question. You can make small changes in the data that you want to collect as you go along. I mean, that's the point of action research. You're being able to take action. You're not locked into keeping things just as you describe them. So I like to think of that as it's kind of a fluid plan that can be adapted as needed. But of course, you don't want to make a lot of big changes because that's going to mean extra work and can put you a little bit behind in your timeline. So in this getting started unit, I want to focus on some of the ethics of action research and also some of the issues that you might encounter. So it is important that we're keeping in mind, in the front of our mind, our participants, the students who are a part of this project. If this were a full-blown research study, there would be a long process for getting ready to do the study. You actually would be needing to seek approval from the university, possibly from the school district, but because this is an action research study and it really follows along the lines of the ordinary things that you are doing in your teaching, some of those processes aren't necessary. But it is important that we're being responsible and we're taking into consideration the learning needs and the situation for the students who are participating in the project. And we are being accountable, and in that sense I would want you to get approval for this project from your principal. You can do that simply through an email or a verbal conversation or by sharing your action research plan with your principal so the principal has a little more awareness of the details of the project. I'm going to leave that up to you, depending on your principal and your relationship with the principal, how you communicate most effectively. We do want to be sensitive to issues of social justice, so we want to make sure that we're treating all student participants equally in the project and caring for and respecting their learning needs. So the students' learning is of the utmost importance, not the project. And so if something has to be tweaked because it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of students, that's really important to keep in mind. Now, I said if this were a full-fledged project, there'd be a lot of steps you'd have to go through, and I just want to describe those so you kind of know what that might be like if you ever go on and do other research. If I were to go into a school right now and do a research project as a university professor, I would have a lot of steps I'd have to follow, and the first one would be I'd have to write up my research plan, a lot like what you wrote for yours, and I would have to submit that to the university, to the Institutional Review Board, and that board meets monthly, so I would have to get it in there, hopefully catch them right before their next meeting, and they would have to look over my project. I'd have to answer some pretty specific questions about how I'm keeping the students safe, I'm not breaking their confidentiality, how I'm keeping all my data in a locked file cabinet so it cannot be accessed by others, how I am assuring that I'm not causing any harm to the students. So hopefully that would be reviewed and approved quickly, but that could take a month or two, depending on my timing. And then I would approach the school district, and various school districts have different ways they handle research within the school district. If I went to the district that I typically work with in Topeka Public Schools, I know that their process requires me to fill out an application form, and that's submitted, and then their research committee meets only 3 times a year. So I have to get I may have to wait a couple of months depending on when I turn in my application. and then their committee reviews it and they can approve it, or they can ask for more information, or they can deny it. And so once I get their approval, then I'm free to go in and start collecting data. So that whole process can take somewhere between maybe 1 to 4 months for me to get approval to do a research study. So we're able to let you bypass some of those processes, but we do want your principal approval, and I'm going to be talking about getting approval from parents and students here coming up. So first step is to get approval from parents, and this is done for students of all ages. In our Canvas course, I've uploaded a parent-informed consent form, and that should be shared with parents. It requires their signature, and I should make sure that you're aware when you see that form, there are statements set off with brackets where you have to insert your own information. So it's really a template, but you make sure that you insert your own information. If you want to slightly alter some of the wording because you think it might be better understood by parents, you are welcome to do that, but you really can't delete any part of that consent form because legally there are some parts that have to be in there. One part that might cause you a little bit to wonder is that you do have to list the benefits of the students participating in the project. And so you may be wondering, well, how are they going to benefit from this? Well, if you're learning about a new instructional strategy, they're going to benefit from that instruction. They're going to benefit from the extra attention that you're giving to that instruction. And so it's important to point that out. Also, there is a statement in the consent form that lets students and parents opt out of the research study at any time. And that has to stay in that form. What you should know from that is it's nothing to worry about. If a student or parent wants the student to opt out, that's perfectly fine. They will still fully participate in your instruction because what you're doing for your study is a normal part of your regular teaching, but you just won't include their data in your write-up of your report. So it's not a big deal. If parents don't agree off the bat, that also is not a problem for what you're doing for our purposes. Parents certainly have the right to not agree. In my experience, I had maybe 10% of the parents who did not agree to have their child participate. Now, my study is a little bit different because I wasn't a normal part of the teaching that was going on. They didn't know me. They might have worried that their students' personal information was going to be out there for others to see, and so that's perfectly fine. So don't worry if you have a parent that does not agree. That's fine. The child is still going to fully participate in what you're doing because it's part of your teaching. You just don't report their data. You also will be using a pseudonym or a fake name for the child in the study. So I and your people on your writing team, as you talk about your project, none of us will know who these children are. Sometimes that makes parents feel better. If you want to add that statement about using a fake name into the parent consent form, you sure can. There also is a student consent form. Definitely should be used with middle and high school students. If you're at the elementary level, I'll leave that up to you. It's not required that you have the student consent form. For the younger students, they may not even understand what it's about. But the older students do need to give their consent to participate, and know also that if they don't agree, that's perfectly fine. You just don't include their data, just like with the parent consent form. But it might help if you explain to the students before you give them the consent form that everyone is participating in the instruction. So this isn't going to get them out of any homework or out of any tests or anything. It just means that their responses won't be shared with other people. And you can share with them that you won't be using their name. And sometimes I've found that older students like it if they can choose their pseudonym or their fake name, then that is kind of makes it fun for them, but you certainly don't have to do that. Those consent forms should be given and collected by you before you start collecting any data for your study. Now, you may have already done some things that you want to use in the study, and that's fine. Just don't include the work of those students and parents that don't agree. So when it comes to kind of the ethics of research, this is what we're working toward. We may not get there exactly, but these are part of the principles of ethics when it comes to conducting research. And one of those is credibility. And so making sure that what you are going to report in your final version of your study, making sure that it's accurate, that the conclusions you draw are accurate. And you can do that by having 3 sources of data, or that triangulation of data. So you're not going to make a conclusion based on just one piece of data. That would not be accurate. That would not make you a credible researcher. You want to have several sources so they can either back each other up or they might not, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. You want to be sure that your conclusions that you're going to draw at the end of your study, that they are useful, transferability, that you could apply them if you were teaching the same class next year, or if you were teaching another section of the class, or if you were working with another group of students. You want to be able to say, well, I think this might work because it worked with this other group. And so to do that, it's important, again, that you're collecting data from different sources, because that supports what your conclusions are and how likely they'll be able to apply to other students in your setting. You also will be creating this really rich, what in research we call a thick description of who the participants are, what they did, what your setting is, so that you can have that full description, so it makes it easier to know if you can transfer that information over to another group of students. Now keep in mind, we're not talking about transferring this to lots of other people, just really in your own teaching setting and your future students or your other students you might work with. It does help if your data collection is dependable, and by replicability we mean that when you describe what you do in your study, in your final paper that you're writing, when you describe that, other people should be able to look at that and say, oh, I want to try this with my own students, and there should be enough information there that they would know what to do. So I'm going to be talking about in my 3rd video about keeping field notes, and that's an important part of making your study replicable. That being replicable helps make your study credible. So this all kind of works together. And then confirming, being able to confirm what you discovered in your study. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about biases and trying to avoid biases as much as possible. But admitting your biases is an important part of helping other people who read your work to be able to say, oh yeah, this might work, but okay, I'm going to be sure that I watch out for this because you have already described how that might be a problem. So let's look at 2 of these areas. One thing you might find is that when you triangulate your data, when you have at least 3 sources of data, one of your sources might disagree with another, and that is perfectly fine. In fact, that is a reflection of that you're being open and honest in your research. So negative results, you may find 2 data sources lead you to a certain conclusion, and one just negates that. It just doesn't even make sense. It doesn't match with what you're finding. And so as a researcher, you have to acknowledge that. There's this level of trust that your readers, who are going to be me and your classmates, and if you go on and use your action research study somewhere else, there may be other people who read it. We have to know that we can trust that your results match up with what you're saying. And so it is important that you acknowledge that you have some results, if you do, some results that don't match. That's okay. That's not a bad thing. We don't want to hide that. We want to be able to say, yeah, I had this, it didn't really line up with everything else, and here's why I think that might be true, or here's what I wonder, or here's what I would do if I continued on with this study to try to figure this out. So that is not a problem. If you find that your results don't match up, that is not a problem. Also, I mentioned before, acknowledging your biases. So we all have biases. You're going into your study with some biases already. You know your students, you may expect them to behave or interact in a certain way, and that may cloud what you do in your study. And that's there. We're not going to get rid of those. So we acknowledge those. So when we write about our methods, or when we analyze what our final data is going to be, we acknowledge that we may have looked at things in a certain way, and that might have influenced things. probably did influence things. That's okay, as long as you acknowledge that's there. So for instance, I talked to you about my study about my students reading their e-textbook. And I had to acknowledge up front that I had a bias in that I was asking my students to respond to their use of the e-textbook, knowing that I wrote the e-textbook myself. So that's the bias that I had, and I had to be aware that my students might they might say certain things or not say certain things because they knew I wrote the book, or because they knew I was the teacher and that I was going to be giving them a grade and that I was going to expect them to respond in a certain way. So I'm acknowledging up front, okay, my data might be a little clouded because I wrote the textbook and because I was the teacher and expected the students might expect that I wanted them to respond in a certain way. And so I had to kind of acknowledge that and then analyze what happened in that light. So that's the important lesson here, is that you're acknowledging your biases up front when you write your research paper, and you address those head on and write about how those might influence what happened in your study. Okay, so the best way to get around some of those issues is to have lots of observations over a long period of time, because then you're collecting more data. So here's my math problem. More time equals more data, which equals more chance to see if the intervention is effective. So the goal here is to get as much time for you to collect data as you can. Now I know some of you have been concerned about how much time the study will take, and I'm hoping that your data are things that you're already doing in your classroom or things that you would normally do in your classroom or your teaching. So the data isn't meant to be extra, it's meant to be things that you might normally be doing with students. I have set aside in our schedule about 6 weeks for you to collect data for this project. Now, you certainly can start before October 9th. I wouldn't continue too far past November 19th because then you're going to run out of time to analyze your data. But that's a pretty good span of time for you to be collecting data. Please kind of think about that and set aside time for you to be doing that. And like I said, you can start before that. Some of you already have some things that you've collected, pre-assessments. That's perfectly fine. But we're not going to add any new pieces to the process during that 6 weeks of time, so that you can focus on collecting that data, so that you have the more data collected, the more chance to see if what you're doing is effective. So that gets you started. Thanks.